It's always a pleasure watching Magnus Carlsen at his very best. The former world champion has arrived at the World Cup, and today I'm here to show you guys his first two games. In the first game, Magnus had the black pieces against Levan Pantsulaia, who opened up with knight f3. Magnus goes knight f6, we have c4, b6, g3, g6, bishop g2, and bishop b7. And here white goes d4, and black goes bishop g7, opting for this double fianchetto setup. White castles, we have castles by black and rook e1, so looking at maybe going e4 in the future. Black plays e6, we have bishop f4, d6, queen c2, and c5. And here white plays d takes c5 and black plays b takes c5 in response, which is the correct choice. If Magnus had played d takes c5 instead, then after knight c3, white would be significantly better because moves like rook d1, e4, and e5 are coming, and this would be very unpleasant for black. A sample line would be something like queen e7, e4 already, something like knight c6 maybe, e5, knight d7, and rook d1. And here note that white is just going to sink this knight into d6 via b5 or maybe e4. And white has a very pleasant position. They pretty much own the d file. So this would be very nice for white. And black really wants no part of this. So that's why b takes c5 was the correct choice, all the way back here. So after b takes c5, white goes knight c3, we have queen e7, and rook a d1. So we're hitting this d6 pawn, which is currently a target for white. But in the future, Magnus probably wants to play d5 whenever the time is right. So here he goes rook d8, just defending the pawn, and white goes queen d2. So after queen d2, the pawn is under attack once again. So knight e8 is played, and here white plays bishop h6. So trying to trade off this dark squared bishop. In this case, trading off the dark squared bishops would be advantageous for white because here, black's dark squared bishop is really guarding his king. So trading off these bishops leaves one less defender for the black king if white ever wants to pursue an attack on the king side. So after bishop h6, we have knight c6, and bishop takes g7 was played, king takes g7, and b3. So b3 simply guards c4, and it prepares a move like queen b2, which would stare at the king from this diagonal. So after b3, black plays knight f6. Remember, we're trying to go d5 here, and white goes queen b2. So after queen b2, note that we're threatening something like knight e4, which would really exploit this pin that's on this knight to the king. So anticipating that, Magnus plays king g8, and now, okay, you've gotten off this diagonal, and we're looking at moves like d5, right? So here white goes rook d2, preparing to double the rooks. But Magnus says, all right, now's the time, and he plays a very timely d5. And here we really have to ask the question for white, which is how do you want to change the structure, right? Because this pawn structure is going to change, and really it's a question of how you want it to change. So white's first option would be the most natural or the most instinctive move after d5, which is to take. And then after e takes d5, you would have these two pawns called the hanging pawns. And here, I think Magnus would have liked this method because note that he is playing black in the World Cup against a strong yet lower rated opponent, so he probably wants to play for a win. And having this pawn dynamic where it's not a symmetrical structure, it's like very different pawn structures, would give him a chance to sort of fight for the center here and then potentially try and get an advantage and take advantage of the fact that it's not this like dry position, right? There's a lot of life left in this position. So after e takes d5, this would have been the hanging pawns case. Something that white probably didn't want to do would be something like rook d1, because after d4 and white's forced to move the knight, black could probably go e5 here, and then this would be very good. Sorry, not b5, c5 for Magnus here. And then he's just storming the center, and he'd already have a big advantage here, I'm sure. So after d5, rook d1 probably isn't the way to go. And the last option, which is what white chose, was the move e3. And here after e3, the point is like, okay, I'm not going to trade and go into the hanging pawn structure, but I'm not going to allow you to go d4 either. So after e3, Magnus immediately played the move d takes c4. And after white recaptured, he played knight a5. So this attacks the c pawn, and it also opens up this light squared bishop, right? So after knight a5, white goes rook takes d8, trading off the rooks. And after rook takes d8, note that black is already a little bit better because white has conceded this d file, maybe momentarily, but still, black currently owns the d file, and white has to address this pawn on c4, right? And it's not really that easy. In the game, I thought maybe something like knight d2, or when I was looking at this game, I thought maybe something like knight d2 would be good. Simply defending this pawn. In the game, Levan played the move knight e5, which also does the same thing, but the knight is definitely a little bit less stable on e5. Here, black played bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and queen c7, which is a pretty simple plan, but it's kind of effective, right? You're attacking this knight, and if this knight moves, then this pawn is not going to be defended. So really, what do you do? So Levan could have tried something like knight b5 here, which would attack the queen and simultaneously defend this knight on e5, right? The problem is that after knight e5, or knight b5, sorry, black can probably throw in a check. So white king would have to move to, say, let's say, g1, and then a6 could be played, really exploiting this pin on the knight. And if you play this as white, you really have to see some follow-up moves. So you have this problem, right? You can't move the knight. So the only way to hold on here would be something like queen c3. So getting the queen off of this line and attacking black's knight in the process. And it would be a pretty tricky position to handle. And in the game, white didn't want to go for such complications. So instead, he played the move rook d1. And rook d1, at first, it looks like it just loses the knight. But remember, we're attacking this rook, right? So after rook takes d1 and knight takes d1, you are defending the knight. So white is not hanging a piece here. However, after this happened, Magnus took on d1, and then after knight takes d1, he simply played the move queen d6 here. So queen d6 attacks this knight on d1, and even though we have we're currently defending everything if we're white, right? We've got the knight defending the pawn and the queen defending the knight. Once queen d6 is played by black, you start to realize that we're kind of out of good options because we need to defend this knight somehow. And if we defend this knight, it might make it harder to defend this knight at the same time. A move like queen a1 is not exactly where you want to put the queen, where it's the only square where it can defend both knights. And if you move this knight with something like, let's say, knight c3, then you've cut off the connection from the queen to the e5 knight. So queen takes e5 will simply be played, and white can basically resign, right? So after queen d6, you start to wonder, like, okay, what do I do? Do I just go passive with this? Do I, what can be done, right? And Levan chose the move knight f3. And the point of this move is that, okay, you can take my d1 knight, right? Nothing's stopping you from taking that knight. But now I'm threatening the knight on f6. So it's sort of a trade. The one drawback with this move is that after Magnus goes queen takes d1, and white played queen takes f6, Magnus was able to snag a pawn, because after knight takes c4, we are no longer defending the c pawn, right? Because the knight went back to f3. So after knight takes c4, black is up a pawn, and now Magnus has some real, concrete edge. He can successfully say, okay, I've got an advantage for sure, and now he just needs to sort of convert. So after knight takes c4, it is kind of difficult considering the fact that white, it's a queen and knight ending, right? And the queen and knight, it's important to note that the queen and knight combination can be very deadly, especially when they're surrounding a king. So after something like knight g5, black definitely has to be careful and play precisely to not fall victim to any incoming attacks, right? So after knight takes c4, it was white's move, so they went e4. And the idea is that you want to take away the d5 square, because having the queen on d5 would be an excellent place to put it. It would pin the knight, it would be centralized, and you'd be threatening. You could probably play e5 and defend f7. You could attack a2. So having the queen on d5 would be very good, right? So white goes e4 to prevent this, and Magnus responds with queen d3. So queen d3 attacks this e-pawn, and it keeps his queen near the king's side, near the king, near the white king, and white responds with knight g5, so simultaneously defending the pawn and now threatening queen takes f7. And here black goes queen d7, so just defending this f7 pawn, keeping everything together nice and solid, right? You've got your extra pawn, and making sure that the king is safe, and then after that, Magnus will move his knight and then try and push the c pawn. So here white plays the move h4, and the idea behind h4 is that he wants to play h5, and after h5, black is either forced to take it, or they'll have to let the pawn go to h6, which would potentially have some real problems with some mating nets. So after h4, black responds with h6, so first we kick the knight, so the knight goes back to f3, and here Magnus played the move queen c6. Now, queen c6 attacks the e-pawn, And it seems like a very good move because at first glance, it seems like white has to retreat to defend it with something like queen f4. However, Levan played the move h5 here, sacrificing yet another pawn, so he's going to be down 2 pawns. But the upside is that he gets to open up black's king a little bit and maybe create some chances for an attack, or simply just increases chances of drawing, right? So after queen takes e4 is played, we have h takes g6. Magnus has to play queen takes g6, and white goes queen f4. So now white is down 2 pawns. However, if things go his way, you can start to see some problems for black. For example, if black plays something like knight b6, we already have moves like knight e5, queen g7, and maybe something like knight g4. And then you're threatening all sorts of things, right? And queen b8 as well. So this could potentially be problematic, but Magnus is quite precise. So he starts with queen d3. So after queen d3, we're keeping this knight on a good square where it prevents knight e5, right? Simply defending it. And after queen d3, white falters with the move queen b8 check. The correct pawn to take was the h6 pawn. Note that it was hanging here. And after queen takes h6, this would give black time to go queen d5 and threaten maybe knight e5 here. And this would still be a complicated game after something like queen f4. Black would still be better, but at least white would have gotten their pawn back, so they're only down 1 pawn. And then black would still try and run the c pawn and keep their advantage, but it would still be an interesting game for sure. Instead, white chose to go for this a7 pawn with queen b8 check. However, there is a very concrete problem with this, which is after the king moves to g7 and we have queen takes a7, Magnus found the brilliant move knight e3 check, sacrificing the knight. And now you see that the point is that if you don't take it, if you go something like king g1, then you get mated on g2, right? If you go king h1, it's the same thing. You get mated. And if you go up to king h3, then you get mated here, queen g2. Or if you go up, we have that, right? So after knight e3, basically you have to take it. So after f takes e3 is played, we had the move queen e2 check. And then after queen e2, white is forced to lose their knight, right? There's nowhere that the king can go where the knight can stay defended. So king h3 was played by white, and black took the knight on f3, right? So what has happened here? So basically, if you look at this position, basically black has traded down, he's traded the knights, and now we're in this endgame with only the queens. And if you count the pawns, black is still currently up a pawn. However, having the knights off makes it much easier for black to simply use this c pawn and try and promote it. When the knights were on the board, there was a lot of danger toward the black king, a lot more complications. But now it's much easier. And note that white can't just pick off the c pawn. If they could, then this would be much easier to try and fight for a draw. But the problem with queen takes c5 is that black has something like queen h1 check, king up, and then f5. And you have to sack the queen, because if you go king f4, we have queen e4, and that's mate. So that's why you can't take on c5. So you must play something else. And here, I mean, even without queen takes c5, black is threatening, queen h1 check, and then f5 and all this stuff. So white starts with a4 here. And the point of a4 is one, obviously you run the pawn and try and get your pawn to the queening square, but also you're keeping the queen on the 7th rank, so that in the case of queen h1 check, f5 is not possible yet, because the pawn is pinned, right? So after a4 was played, Magnus goes queen h1 check. We have king g4 and queen e4 check. So Magnus takes this opportunity to try and pick up another pawn. After king h3, before going for the e3 pawn, he decides to simply go c4, saying that, okay, this pawn's not going anywhere, and white really has to deal with this threat of c3, c2, and just queening. And you can't trade down into an ending with queen d4 check because this pawn is way too close. So after c4, white goes queen c7. So just trying to keep this queen both on the 7th rank and looking at the c pawn. And black goes king g6. So now we have a real problem if we're white, because now queen h1 check and then f5 is a real threat because the pawn's no longer pinned. So after king g6, white goes king h2. But now black goes queen c2, very precise. And then after king h3, Magnus picks up the a pawn, which is definitely the pawn he wanted to take. Because after queen takes a4, now there's no pass pawn for white, and this c pawn is just going to be unstoppable. And after queen takes a4, white actually resigned in this position because having the 2 extra pawns and simply there's no way to successfully give a perpetual or something like that because black's queen is going to be much too powerful here. So after something like queen f4, black would simply bring the queen back and there'd be no perpetual. So after this, Levan Pantsulaia resigned and Magnus Carlsen won game 1 of his first round at the World Cup. So the second game was much more exciting. The colors were reversed, so Magnus had the white pieces, and the World Cup format required that he only needed a draw to move on to the next round. However, being the highest rated player in the world, he was definitely looking to win. So in this game, he started off with c4, Levan played c5, we had knight f3, g6, and d4. And here, normally, if I have the black pieces in these types of positions, I want to play c takes d4 to really avoid what Magnus does in the game. Here, black plays bishop g7 and white plays d5. So Magnus gains some space. And after d6, he plays e4, and we have e6. After e6, white goes h3, and black plays knight e7. Knight c3 is the follow-up, and here, black plays h6. h6 is a bit of an interesting move. I guess it takes control of g5, and maybe black is looking to play g5 at some point in the future. And also, I guess against moves like d takes e6 and bishop takes e6, it prevents the response of knight g5, or just putting a piece on g5 in general. So after h6, white played d takes e6, bishop takes e6, and bishop f4. So this is very simple chess by Magnus. It's this idea that, okay, we've taken on e6, opening up this queen. And now we have a weak pawn on d6, right? This pawn cannot move forward. So what do we do when we've got a weak pawn? We simply put our pieces on squares where we attack it, right? So now we've got 2 attackers. It's pretty difficult to defend this pawn. Luckily, black doesn't really need to. He can sort of give away this pawn in hopes of getting some compensation, which is the correct choice. Here, black goes knight c6, and white plays queen takes d6. So Magnus grabs a pawn. And black doesn't want to trade queens, so he plays the move queen a5. And now he's threatening a few things. He's threatening moves like rook d8, bishop takes c3 is a big threat because you'd be winning a rook on a1, so Magnus plays queen d2. So after queen d2, you've got your queen sort of out of danger, and you're defending this knight. The problem is that black really has some good compensation here in the form of activity. And here, Levan shows the move knight b4. It's not the best move, but you can definitely see the appeal, which is the idea that, first of all, you want to get your rook to d8, and then potentially looking at moves like knight d3 in the future. And the other reason why knight b4 looks appealing is because it's not really easy to kick this knight out. Moves like a3 are essentially bluffs, because you're never going to be able to take this knight until you move the bishop and get castled, because the rook is going to hang, right? So after knight b4, white plays the move a3, which is just like, okay, we're attacking this knight, but we're not really threatening to take it at the moment. And black plays g5. So gaining some space, and this is really what black needs to do in this position, where he's down a pawn, but he's got the initiative. He needs to gain some space, activate his pieces, and sort of put white's pieces on these uncomfortable, awkward squares, and make sure that his compensation is known. So after g5, white plays bishop h2, and we have rook d8. So rook d8 attacks the queen, and now white is forced to play queen c1. And queen c1 is good. It's a good square because now you're defending the rook, so you really are threatening a takes b4 now. And here black plays knight d3 check, which is actually a mistake, or I guess you could call it an inaccuracy. The computer suggests the move knight c6, which is a bit odd considering that you played knight b4 probably with the intention of going knight d3. However, after knight c6, you realize that even if white gets something like bishop e2 and tries to castle, after black goes knight d4, it's kind of difficult because now you're threatening moves like knight b3. If you take the knight, you could potentially see problems with this pin. And simply, even if you don't go knight d4, this position is definitely not so bad for black, despite the fact that they're down a pawn, because they have such control over the d4 square, specifically just these dark squares along this diagonal, with white's bishop being out of play on h2. And just the fact that the c and e pawns, they're sort of blunting this light squared bishop. Black's pieces are simply much more active, and this is what gives black the compensation that they require. But after knight d3, instead of knight c6, now it gives white the opportunity to get rid of this bad bishop, and then get their king to safety. And I guess the idea behind this was that now black gets the pawn back with bishop takes c4 as Levan played in the game. However, this allows white to sort of turn the tide and change things up. So basically before, white was the one with the extra pawn, and black was the one with the compensation, keeping white's king in the center. But now white's safely castled, and it's Magnus's turn to sort of turn things around, and he actually ends up playing knight d5, so sacrificing a pawn of his own, but now black's the one who's going to have their king in the center. So after knight d5, the idea is that now you're hitting this bishop on c4, so black plays bishop takes d5 to sort of take this knight and get the bishop out of danger, and after e takes d5, black definitely doesn't want to let this pawn get to d6, so after rook takes d5, you're up a pawn, but white plays rook e1, and now you can't really castle because of this pin, right? So here, black plays the move queen d8, but white follows it up with queen c4. And now you see the point, which is that if black castles here, rook takes e7 will be played because the rook will hang, right? And then white will be up a piece. So after queen c4, you can't castle, so you play king f8 instead. This is what black did here. So if rook takes e7, we have king takes e7. And after king f8, white is slightly better, which is definitely a good thing considering the fact that you're down a pawn. When the computer says that the position is equal or you're slightly better when you've given up material, it means that the compensation is definitely still there. And usually the opposing side has to play more precisely to not basically get killed in the center, right? As in this case. So king f8, black can't castle now. And here white needs to sort of keep this attack going. And Magnus finds the move knight e5. Now, knight e5 centralizes this knight at first, and really what it does is that it immobilizes this rook on d5, because if this rook moves to, let's say, d4, then you have mate on f7. And if this knight is captured, this would be very bad for black, because after something like rook h7 or rook g8, because the rook is hit, then bishop f6 is pretty much super deadly, because this pin is awful. I mean, rook d7, and then you could sort of pile on the pressure with queen e4, you could double the rooks, and white would have a ton of compensation here and probably be winning, in fact, because this position is just so strong with his bishop dominating the knight and the king being so weak, right? So after bishop takes e5, that would be the problem. So that's why after knight e5, black played the move knight c6. And here, to give credit to Levan, he was finding very good moves. It's not easy at all to defend a position where Magnus Carlsen is trying to attack you, and he found the right ways to defend. Specifically in this position, the move knight c6 is good because you want to get rid of the this very threatening knight. And after trading the knights, even though you double your pawns, the fact that black is up a pawn will mean that he sort of comes out in this scenario. So Magnus doesn't want to trade, and here he finds a really nice move. He finds the move rook a d1. The point of rook a d1 is that you're obviously attacking this rook. And once again, you can't trade on d1. You can't take this quote-unquote free rook because now queen takes f7 is mate. That's why you can't move the rook. And if you don't move the rook, if you play like knight takes e5, then after queen takes d5, white's winning because they've got this exchange up. So you need a way to simultaneously prevent queen takes f7, but also defend your rook somehow. And black comes up with the move knight d4. And this cuts off this attack on d5, and the rook doesn't have to move. So all is well here. It's not there's not like an immediate win or anything. It's actually equal according to the computer, but white obviously has the attack going, and he wants to find a way to break through. So here notice that black is right now threatening to play something like bishop takes e5, and after you take on e5 and white would take back, there's a lot of these weird discoveries with stuff like knight f3 check, because after g takes f3, then the rook will be opened to attack on d1. So if something random like a4, maybe you could envision something like this. And rook takes d1, and then it gets real messy. So to prevent this, Magnus goes king h1, so that knight f3 never comes with check. And after king h1, black plays the move b5. So b5, the idea behind it is that you want to kick this queen away, because right now, the reason you can't move this knight is because the queen and the rook will be attacking the rook on d5. So if you play b5 and the queen moves back somewhere to, let's say, f1, then you can move the knight and then the rook won't be under attack. However, the problem with b5 is that, or not exactly the problem with b5, just the move that Magnus played in response was queen d3. And the idea is that now you still can't move this knight because the rook will be hanging. And the move queen d3 can be difficult to play because you're really putting your queen on a square where if this knight has some discovery, then the queen is hit. However, it's important to note that right now black doesn't have any good discoveries, especially the fact that this king is not on g1. It's on h1, so knight f3 check or knight e2 check will never happen. So the queen on d3 is relatively safe. And once again, you immobilize this knight. So after queen d3, black has nothing else to do but to play something like h5, expanding on the king side, maybe trying to create more space for his pieces to get out. But after h5, Magnus keeps the very interesting moves going. He plays the move knight c6. So knight c6 forks both the queen and the knight, and the knight cannot take because after knight takes c6, then you lose the exchange. And white would be winning here. So after knight c6, you have to move the queen. So black chooses to go queen b6, and white goes knight e7. So now it's starting to look dangerous for black because the knight's just hopping all over the place, and black really needs to play very precisely to not put their pieces on these squares where a fork could occur. So he chooses to move rook d8, just moving the rook back, and here Magnus plays knight f5. So the knight has made this interesting journey, hopping to d5, to e7, to f5. Note that you still can't take it because of queen takes d8 here, and the idea for white is to take this bishop on g7 and then bring this bishop to e5 and sort of liberate his pieces. The bishop on h2 is not really doing much, but when it gets into the game, it will be a very powerful piece. So after knight f5, black actually blundered with the move queen g6. What he needed to do was play bishop f6 so that this bishop can both stay on a square where it can't be captured, and it will add an extra defender to this rook on d8 so this knight can eventually move. The problem with queen g6 is that I believe what Levan was thinking was maybe knight takes g7 would be played, and then you could trade the queens, or simply pinning this knight to the queen is very good because it sort of prevents white from wanting to move it, because the queen trade will be not so advantageous for white when they're trying to attack. But the problem with queen g6 is that it falls to the move bishop c7, which Magnus found. And after bishop c7, you start to realize that black's position has a lot of danger in it. So for example, if you play something like rook e8, then bishop d6 check can be played because this rook is no longer on the d file. And then, you don't want to sack your queen for the bishop. So after king g8, you just lose a rook, which would be very bad, obviously. And if you play the move like rook c8, then it's even worse because after bishop d6 check, the king must move because you don't want to take. But now you lose the queen anyway with knight e7 check, king h7, and then knight takes g6. So after this, black would be in all sorts of trouble. So here, black tries to defend with the move rook d7, saying, okay, now you can't go bishop d6 check at all because I'll take it, right? The problem with rook d7 is that it allows mate. It allows a mating sequence, which Magnus found almost instantly. He played the move rook e8 check, and black actually resigned in this position. Rook e8 check is a brilliant move. The point is that you must take the rook. And after king takes e8, white simply goes queen e4 check, and it's essentially a mate in 4 at worst here. And the idea is that if black goes rook e7, obviously you just play queen takes e7 and take it. But against anything else, you play the move queen a8. And the idea is that your pieces are all perfectly placed, taking away these key squares that the black king could potentially run to, and it's going to be mate soon. For example, after queen e4, besides rook e7, the only logical moves are, let's start with queen e6, right? Then we've got queen a8 check. The king can't move up because the knight guards the e7 square, so you must block, and then queen takes d8 is mate. If you block with the knight, then queen a8 check. Once again, king can't move up. So you can block with the rook or the knight. In fact, if you block with the knight, or the rook really for that matter, you can actually sack your queen. You don't really have to. I guess you do have to, but it's just a nice checkmate. With rook takes d8 and then you sack your queen. If you play rook d8, then it's the one where you don't have to. You can play just rook takes d8 and then mate. Or you can sack your queen. Doesn't matter. So after queen e4, we've covered knight e6 and queen e6. The other move is bishop e5, but same thing. We've got queen a8 check, and that's mate. So basically, the only thing left is king f8. And then queen a8 check is going to be mate once again because the knight covers the e7 square, which is really the most important point. Which is that the fact that this knight went to d5, to e7 to f5, and from there it really took away this e7 square. And even if this bishop wasn't there, the g7 square would be covered. So this knight does a really good job of boxing the king in, and Magnus found this amazing checkmating sequence, starting with this incredible move, just rook e8 check, just putting the rook on a square where it can be captured, and then this leads to a mate in 4. So this is a brilliant game by Magnus to cap off his first round at the World Cup, going 2-0 against a strong grandmaster, and just an amazing performance by him. So I believe at this point, at the time I'm releasing this video, the Tari match should be going. So Magnus should be in his next round against Aryan Tari, but I will cover that later when the second game wraps up. So that's it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it or learned something, I encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe. And but besides that, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next video.